This, I'm afraid, is very true of all writers, whether they admit it or not. That one of the great mortifications of my adult life has been to see this fellow, who was at college with me the same year, and who I would never say was a rival, but was certainly turkey cooking in the same field of hens at college time. To see him, to see this character shoot past me to the bestseller list, prize list, and it really began. He started off with a novel in which I appear as a paedophile called Drippy McDuff's Whittler. But his climb to stardom began with a book on which revolved around Catherine the Great, at one remove, a study of Count Potemkin. And since then, astonishing work on Stalin that has made him an object of intense hatred among Russian historians who have failed to find the documents he has dug up and the secrets he has uncovered. And he's really brought Stalin to life as a human being in a way that was totally lost beneath the sort of the Soviet image and the anti-communist propaganda, bringing the real man back to life, an extraordinary achievement. And then, just when you think you can pin him down as a Russian expert, he goes off and writes a book on Jerusalem that remained at the top 10 of the Times bestseller list for some revolting length of sort of 6 months. Completely unforgivable for his friends, colleagues, and would-be rivals. So I think I'm just going to throw it all in and hand over.
Thank you very much, Willie. That's horribly exaggerated, of course, but very nice of you to say all that. Now, I was told, by the way, that there were no speeches at this thing. You were going to be cross-questioning me. But you broke it to me quite relatively recently on a walk up the creek that you'd done no preparation at all. And therefore, I was totally on my own. So let me tell you, go to the beginning. Catherine the Great and her lover, Prince Potemkin, are two of the great names of history. Catherine the Great, sadly, had been sent on a sort of tragic mission to the alleyways of history as a sort of nymphomaniac, sniggered at by schoolboys. Potemkin was more famous as her pimp, her lover, and for making false villages, the Potemkin villages. And so when I was studying at Cambridge, probably with you, the Enlightened Despots, I realized that there'd been no biography of their relationship, of Potemkin and Catherine the Great. And I resolved to do something about it. And when I arrived in the Russian archives, I discovered soon that the strange thing about the Russian archives is, and unlike any other archive in the world, they actually don't want you to find anything at all. And they will do anything to obstruct you. And I remember arriving there and asking for certain sort of fonts where they had their Catherine the Great and Potemkin's love letters, and then telling me that there were no letters there at all. So when I actually gave the actual number of the file, they had to finally sulkily take me to these places where, of course, there were thousands of letters. And when I sat down to read them for the first time, I was sitting down in this empty study room of this empty archive, and suddenly I heard this kind of squealing sound, and something landed on my head, scratching my scalp. And I pulled it off, and it was a kitten that had ripped my hair. And I looked up at the gallery, and there was the archivist waving at me like this. And she dropped the kitten on my head to welcome me to my first day in the Russian archives. So, of course, that was the beginning of the loss of my hair too, but that's another story. But working in the Russian archives isn't good for one's hair, or anything else for that matter. But the fascinating thing about these archives was, you'd think that these are huge names, but due to the sort of strange byways of history, no one had really studied Catherine and Potemkin since the late 1890s. Really, only in 1905, when the revolution liberalized everything in Russia, did historians for the first time start to look at these documents. And the reason is because they're so shocking. they are probably the greatest love letters ever written. Forget Napoleon and Josephine, Antony and Cleopatra. The wonderful thing about these two is that they were equals. They were both as brilliant as each other, and they really were two of the most gifted statesmen in all of history. I think Catherine the Great was probably the most gifted female statesman of modern times, if you count the 18th century as modern times. And Potemkin was just an extraordinary, flamboyant, eccentric. But the point was, he was brilliant politically. He had imagination, he was a visionary, but unlike many visionaries, he could actually do things. And it's an interesting thing that recently, Catherine the Great is suddenly very fashionable. Everyone wants to make movies of Catherine the Great's life. Angelina Jolie has just bought the rights to this book, which is exciting. But I think part of the reason why she's in the air is because of President Putin. And one of the great achievements of Catherine and Potemkin was that they actually annexed an area of Russia, eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine, called New Russia. And Potemkin's greatest claim to fame was that he annexed that little delicious jewel that hangs lushly into the Black Sea, the Crimea. And he annexed it, and there are many letters where he writes to Catherine the Great saying, we've got to annex it. It's essential to Russia. After all, this is the place where St. Vladimir, the great Grand Prince of Kiev, first converted to Christianity, hence converting Russia to Orthodoxy. Funny enough, soon after annexing the Crimea, Vladimir Putin gave a very similar speech, saying, this is the holy place for Russia. In fact, this is our Temple Mount. And it's a strange thing that when I was starting to, when I just published this book, I got a request to meet one of the top apparatchiks from the Kremlin. And remember, this is in 2000, when President Putin had literally just been elected president. Unknown quantity, believed to be very enlightened, believed to be very liberal, but no one really knew who he was. And I met this person in great secrecy in the Dorchester Hotel, which is a sort of ludicrously posh hotel in London. And this guy asked me all these questions about Catherine the Great and Potemkin, the Crimea, and it's only, at the time, I presumed that they were asking, already knowing these things, because obviously these are huge historical characters, but the fact is no one had written about them since the 1890s. And when I worked in the archives, no one had opened these archives or used these archives. No one had signed the forms for over 70 years. So it was a very strange thing. So I was asked to write a short memorandum for somebody about what they'd done in the Crimea, how they justified it. And of course, I presumed that it was somehow going to be translated for somebody important, maybe even the president. But now, 15 years later, it all seems both surreal and yet somehow prescient, even prophetic, or perhaps it really was for the president himself. And either way, another thing that happened just at the same time was that President George W. Bush was going for his first visit to Moscow to meet Putin. And when he went, for some reason, he got my book, this book, Potemkin, Catherine the Great and Potemkin. And his wife gave an interview to the English papers in which she said that they'd spent their evenings in bed reading the love letters of Catherine the Great and Potemkin to each other, with each him playing the part of Potemkin and him playing the character of Catherine. Now, this may be a vision that you don't want to contemplate. I have to admit, it's not a vision I want to contemplate. But anyway, nonetheless, when he arrived in the Winter Palace to see round with Putin said, do you want to see Peter the Great? And President Bush said, no, I want to see Catherine the Great and Potemkin. And so, anyway, for whatever reasons, this extraordinary couple, were in the air at that moment in 2000, just when my book was published by luck. And it was as a reward for rehabilitating these two great Russian statesmen that the government allowed me to go into the Stalin archives for the first time, because I really had no reason. I was not an academic, I was not a senior, I was just a young person who'd written this book on Catherine the Great and Potemkin. And yet they said, you can have these things first. And it was a sort of reward for rehabilitating these two great men, great couple. Now, when I said that they were wonderful together, I think it's probably the greatest partnership of a man and a woman in all of history, politically, because they were equal. She was incredibly orderly. She was, of course, German-born, came to Russia when she was 14. She was a graphomaniac, she said so. She was kind of an obsessional person, and of course, all great politicians have to be obsessional. She was obsessed with writing and reading. She was obsessed with planting. She called it plantomania. She was obsessed with English matters. She was an Anglomaniac. And all the time, she legislated, and she loved writing laws. She was humane. She was thoughtful. In Potemkin, she found her perfect collaborator. He was imaginative, passionate, emotional. While she woke up at sort of 6 in the morning and made her own coffee, not wanting to wake the servants, and started writing her letters, he would be having orgies with women like an Ottoman sultan, sleep for days on end, hardly get off his sofa, and then suddenly build a fleet, found a city, and it was almost as a miraculous character. I mean, he died at 52, exhausted, and so did, as did Peter the Great. I mean, these people achieved a massive amount. And the Peter the Great parallel is interesting because Peter the Great founded Petersburg and founded the Baltic Fleet and made Russia a naval power. Potemkin and Catherine did a parallel thing down in the south. They founded great cities. Potemkin's greatest city is Sebastopol, the naval base in the Crimea, which is so important to President Putin today. So weirdly, this couple are suddenly terribly relevant again. And their love affair on a purely romantic basis, that's the political story. They actually ruled together, and they became secret husband and wife. He had the same access to the treasury that she did, and they decided things together. And she often said, two heads are better than one, you're my left hand, I'm the right hand, and so on and so forth. They decided everything together, often in very passionate arguments. He was more than a prime minister. He was a co-czar. And he's really the only example of someone like this in the whole of Russian history, because at the moment I'm just finishing a history of the Romanov dynasty, which goes right from Ivan the Terrible right up to Nicholas II. And there's no prime minister. Potemkin is definitely the greatest prime minister of the Romanov dynasty. They did everything together. And somebody said, no wonder they love each other, because they're so alike. But this brings me on to the romantic side. In terms of pure romance, there's no one really who comes close to this, because we have something like 3,000 love letters between them. And these love letters vary from 20-page letters on, shall we go to war against Prussia? Shall we build a fleet? One of the things they were discussing, by the way, relevant for America, was whether to lend whether to lend King George III of England some Russian troops to put down an annoying rebellion among colonists in the New World, which of course would have changed America considerably. We might all be speaking Russian now, and Brighton Beach might not be the only Russian-speaking area of New York. But anyway, so these letters are extraordinary. There's politics in them. There's a lot of health. Of course, they were great hypochondriacs. All the best people are, aren't they? And they were constantly writing to each other about their piles, their hemorrhoids, their hangnail, their sore throats, kind of thing me and William talk about all the time in our letters. And so they were always kind of arrived. They were both highly strung, incredibly kind of needy people. They had to be the center of attention. They were constantly kind of telling each other, helping each other get over sort of terrible crises. And the other thing they always talked about, of course, was sex. They were both incredibly passionate people, both incredibly sexual, in very different ways. He wanted as many women as he could have, but he started with the Empress. She was a serial monogamist, not the nymphomaniac of legend at all, but a serial monogamist who's always had to be in love with somebody. We all know people like that in our own lives. And she always was incredible. That person, she was totally head over heels with and would hear nothing bad about them. As she got older, into her 60s, a bit like a sort of aging female rock star, she started to have younger and younger lovers. And these lovers, she was in her 60s, overweight, overweight, somewhat dyspeptic. These young lovers were beautiful young guardsmen of 21 years old, who, of course, were keen to be her lover because she was incredibly generous to them, made them the wealthiest people in Russia and their whole families. But the downside was, of course, in the end, these young peacocks at the Russian court, surrounded by the most beautiful ladies in waiting, of course, fell in love with someone their own age and started to cuckold the empress. And, of course, it was Potemkin's job to come back from Sebastopol or wherever he was and try and tell her that this ludicrous boy was now making a fool of her and she had to get rid of him. To which she would say, but I'm totally in love with him. Of course not. I'm teaching him the classics. And she used to have a euphemism. She used to say, Russia needs me to teach future civil servants about the world, which was her kind of euphemism for a very elderly woman seducing 21-year-old guardsmen. But you know what? She did it because she could, and who wouldn't? So I don't hold it against her at all, and nor should you. So that was the future of their relationship. But at the height of their relationship, their love affair was very much based on a complete passionate physical and mental attraction. It was love on the highest level. But they would write to it. She once wrote to him. She said, literally, "What have you done, Monsieur Potemkin, to make a fool of the woman with the most brilliant mind in Europe?" She said, "I'm going to have to give every hair on my body the order not to be excited at the very thought of you. You've made a fool of me, Monsieur Potemkin, and I have to restrain myself." But she couldn't, and she was wildly in love with him. He wanted to be more than just a peacock. He did not want to be a young man walking in the round behind the empress while she decided everything. She knew this from the beginning, and when she made him her lover, she had to promote him immediately to run the army, the foreign policy, and then in the end, virtually everything with her. And that's why she hesitated for a long time before inviting him to become her lover, because he would never accept just being a sort of gigolo. And all the lovers who came afterwards, after they'd secretly married, they sort of broke up in a really bizarre and unique arrangement, which may be a model for modern marriage, I don't know. They married, they then broke up. He became Khazar, sort of chief minister, her closest minister and advisor, and she then set off on having about a series of young lovers, increasingly young lovers, each one she was wildly in love with, who had no power and influence whatsoever. Potemkin decided everything. The most interesting thing I found in the archives about how this system worked, because there was a system. Now, by arranging a system, Catherine, with her very Germanic mind, orderly mind, thought that if everything was open, there would be no kind of accusations of secret deals, of corruption, and so on. So she made the job of her lover an actual position at court, adjutant general. And the adjutant general was her lover. He had an apartment above hers. He could come down the green staircase, visit her. And after Potemkin, they all had to know their place. And they were really treated like children. At the same time, Potemkin, now the most powerful man in Russia, brought his 5 gorgeous nieces from his provincial village to Petersburg, where they became the richest heiresses in Russia. And he slept with 3 of them himself. Now, this is extremely shocking to modern sensibilities, isn't it, uncles? But in fact, at that time, Voltaire was sleeping with his niece and so on. It wasn't quite as shocking in those days as it is today. But anyway, he also embarked on an extraordinary love affair with many, many mistresses. In fact, what I was asking that archivist who dropped the cat on my head was, where are the love letters from women to Potemkin? And that was the room that she was claiming didn't exist. And when I found that there was in fact boxes full of these letters, this man was tireless. And these women were, well, if you think about traveling then, took 6 days to get from St. Petersburg. He worked out a way to get in the winter to get within 12 days from Sebastopol to St. Petersburg. He created a sort of a sleigh like a Sputnik, where you got in and you got to put your feet in like a fighter plane, and you just lay back, and it was full of furs. And then the horses just went, and they just went as fast as they could for days, just changing horses without him ever getting out, except to have a pee on the way and a vodka, and just keep going. And he didn't stop till he arrived. Then he just burst into the Winter Palace. Now, when he burst into Winter Palace, we know all about this because, unlike today, when everyone's deleting their emails or losing them, those days, all these letters still exist, and they are very like emails. When he arrived, he would write, and we have one letter I've actually seen where he writes on the email, "I've just arrived, frozen from the road. I've done it in record time. I'm in the Winter Palace and she wrote back, and then you can almost hear the pitter-patter of the servant running down the many corridors of the Winter Palace. I mean, probably lots of you have been to the Winter Palace, have you? How many of you have been to Petersburg? Yeah, so a lot of you have been. So, running along those corridors, and then she writes, "Oh, my darling, I just want to come and kiss you. When can I come?" And then the pitter-patter again of the guy running back, and then he writes underneath, I'm just getting into a hot bath. I won't be human until I've done that. But do we have any food? This is from the most powerful man in Europe to the most powerful woman. So then pitter-patter, pitter-patter, and then underneath she writes, "We have tons of food. I'm having it laid out now in the banya," because they love to meet in the banya with the sort of Russian bath, which was lovely and warm in freezing St. Petersburg. And finally he said, I'm almost ready. And she just said, "I cannot wait just to come and kiss you passionately, my darling General Prince." So, these love letters are really, really touching, actually. And I have to say, given where we are in 2015, that these two people were so. Of course, there were terrible battles and massacres during the battles when they stormed Turkish fortresses and so on. But they really were trying to look after their troops, look after people, do the right thing as much as you could in the 18th century. And they really were very much the most humane and enlightened rulers I think Russia's ever had. And that includes Nicholas II and Yeltsin and Putin. And admittedly, the bar isn't too high in Russia. But still, they were over 200 years ago. Now, I think I've got... What time is it? Anybody? 10 minutes. 10 minutes to Q&A. Let me just tell you how it started. On the 28th of June, 1762, Catherine, who was then married to the dreadful, puny, poxy and incompetent Emperor Peter III, was lying asleep in her gorgeous little exquisite boutique of a villa at Peterhof, which is Montplaisir, built by Peter the Great, one of his favorite houses. She was asleep. She was planning a coup against her husband because he was planning to have her either killed or arrested and divorced and consigned forever to a monastery in Siberia. Now, she had a lover. She'd already had several love affairs in which she'd won enormous friends in Russia by being more Russian than her dreadful German husband who refused to learn Russian. And she had managed to provide an heir. No one knew how, but she had. No one quite knew who fathered it. In fact, the Emperor Peter III said, "My wife keeps getting pregnant, but I don't know how she does it." Which gives you an idea of why he wasn't a very competent emperor. And so her latest lover was Grigory Orlov, and a guardsman, a handsome guardsman. And they were planning this coup. Planning a coup was a very dangerous thing in Russia because it was an absolute monarchy. If you failed, you died. Whoever lost their head too. And at 4 a.m, the conspirators, led by Orlov, Grigory Orlov, and his brother, Alexei Scarface Orlov, who was a sort of giant, he was known as Le Balafré, the Scarface in French. They had discovered that one of their best friends had been arrested and was being tortured that day and would reveal the conspiracy, which would lead to all of them to go to the gallows. So Grigory Orlov said, "I will raise the guards. You, my brother, the Scarface, go out and get Catherine, the emperor's wife, who had no claim on the throne whatsoever, remember. She is a minor German princess from a place called Zerbst in Germany." So he gallops off in a carriage. His carriage arrives at Montplaisir. He bursts in. Catherine sits up. He says, "Tonight, it's now or never. It's either the gallows or the throne or the crown. We've got to go." And as she comes, she dresses very fast. literally putting on her sort of doing her hair as she goes to the revolution. She jumps in the carriage. On the back of the carriage, jumping on the back, is a young guardsman, 20 years old, Grigory Potemkin, her future lover, future husband, partner. And they whiz off towards the revolution, galloping through the night of Petersburg in June. That warm June night. And as they go, they suddenly see ahead another carriage. It's Grigory Orlov. He's meeting her, but more importantly, he's bringing Michelle, her French hairdresser, because this is an age of theatricality, of costume. And if you're going to seize power at this time, you need to look good. So Michelle jumps in the back and does her hair as they go to seize power. By the time they've arrived, her hair is looking magnificent. She's dressed beautifully. Potemkin's still on the back. Both Orlovs are with her. They arrive at the guards' barracks. They shout "Vivat," and she's hailed as Catherine II. So she's gone, literally, from a very provincial German girl, brought at 14 to the Russian court, with no relation whatsoever to the House of Romanov, none whatsoever, has become Empress of Russia. She goes to the Winter Palace. She's hailed by everyone. Meanwhile, out at Peterhof, which is outside St. Petersburg, the poor Peter III has just arrived to meet his wife, to collect her to hold his birthday party, and he already hates her. He's planning what to do with her. He's arrested someone. He knows that there's a conspiracy against him. If he finds her, she's finished. But for the moment, appearances must be respected. So he arrives, and he goes into her house. Usually, he treats her appallingly, calls her a fool and an idiot all the time in public. He walks in and throws open her bedroom door. There's nobody there. All there is the dress she was going to wear for that night, left on the bed. And he looks at it, and one's hair must stand on end as one says this, because he realizes it's over. She's beaten him to the pistol, if you like. And he just looks at it, and he runs out. And he's got this whole court there, the chancellor, field marshals, and he just bursts into tears, and he says, it's over. She's beaten us. She's done it. She's gone. And they all know what that means. And every time he sends somebody to Petersburg to see her, they change sides and join her, and they don't come back. And there are then terrible scenes where he tries to go and take control of the navy, but by the time he arrives at the naval base by a ship, the naval base has joined her. Everyone joins her, because even though these are actually two Germans, she's the one who's cultivated everyone brilliantly. She's so clever. She said, the key to politics is women. And I've cultivated all the old women. I've spent hours listening to them talk about their favorite Pekingese dog. And I know the names of every old lady, every dowager countess's dog in Petersburg. And that's how you seize power, she says. And but also, of course, she's brilliant with men. She's actually being a little disingenuous with that story, because men love her. She's not beautiful, but she's slightly boyish, blue-eyed, auburn-haired, and small, curvaceous, but incredibly clever, charismatic, and kind of irresistible when she wants something. And everybody at the Russian court was passionately in love with her, because there is something very winning, is there not, about a princess or an empress in terrible danger, showing exceeding courage, So that's the situation. So everyone's in love with her. The whole guards are in love with her. And she sees this, so now she's in power. She has Petersburg. Now, when her advisor, she says, what do I do now? And they say, well, you're not safe until we've arrested your husband, Peter III. And he's outside Petersburg. He's at Peterhof. We are going to have to march off and arrest him. And so they gather the guards. She rides out to the guards. By the way, I mentioned costume. She dresses up in a man's costume of the Preobrazhensky Guards, which is Peter the Great's Guards regiment. And she looks great in this regiment. She looks great in a man's costume. And she gets on her horse, and as she rides out to see the guards, waiting amongst the guards is young Sergeant Potemkin, a totally unheard of person who has forced his way into this conspiracy just by going along and saying, I want to join. And so he's watching her too. Everyone's watching. The guards stiffen to salute and shout, Vivat Catherine II. And as she drives out, young Potemkin notices that she's got a slight fault with her guard's uniform, which is, of course, terribly important in those days. She's missing the sword knot around the sword that she's holding, which is terribly important in the 18th century. He rides up to her across the thing without any invitation, introduces himself, Sergeant Potemkin, Your Imperial Majesty, in perfect French, even though he's just from a small village with very poor family that owned only a few serfs. He goes up, introduces himself, and says, Your Imperial Majesty, you're lacking the sword knot on your sword. May I give you present you with my own? She's delighted with him, and of course he's extremely handsome. He also has auburn hair, which he wears extremely long. His nickname in the Guards is Alcibiades. And those of you who know your Athenian history know that Alcibiades was the most beautiful man in Athens, but also the cleverest. And so she takes the sword knot, and then all her top officers, the Orloffs, are saying, right, it's time we get set off for the march. But something's gone wrong. Potemkin's horse won't take the order to leave the side of the Empress. And of course, this is very Potemkin, but he claimed afterwards that the horse had been trained to ride in squadron. So, of course, it wouldn't leave riding when it was beside. But, of course, he was not going to leave a moment too soon. And he later said that all my life, my greatest love of my life, and the greatness, my rise to total greatness, I owe to one stubborn horse. So she went out, she rested her husband. He was strangled soon afterwards. It was a rough game being a Tsar. In fact, 6 of the last 12 emperors of Russia were murdered. It's quite a breathtaking thought. Catherine came to power, and she didn't forget Potemkin. She gave him special awards, serfs, estates, in her sort of accession honors, if you like. 12 years later, in the biggest crisis of her reign, which I don't have time to tell you now, she wrote a letter to the now General Potemkin, who was besieging a town in present-day Bulgaria. And she said to him, Dear Chevalier and Lieutenant General, you may wonder why I'm writing to you. You probably have better things to do looking at the siege which you're conducting on my behalf. But I just wish to say that I'm writing you this letter to tell you that I am thinking about you, and this is the way I'm thinking about you, and you are not to risk your life on any account, but to preserve it, for it is very dear to your motherland and its sovereign. Well, Potemkin jumped on his horse and rode all the way back from Bulgaria to St. Petersburg and became her lover. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the story of Catherine and Potemkin. Is there any... Yeah.
If you're going to have one of your friends beat you flat, it's not a bad way to go, is it? Any questions? This lady in the front here.
Thank you, why do you think in the 200 years since Catherine, Russia and the Soviet Union have not had a woman leader? And Russian society seems to be really sexist. What's your opinion?
It's a very good question. I mean, the most bizarre thing about the Romanov dynasty of Russian history is that in the 18th century, there were 5 Russian sovereigns who were women, because Peter the Great left no male. He made his. I mean, the extraordinary thing is when Peter the Great died, he had no heirs. He wanted to control his heirs. His wife was literally a peasant girl, sort of not a prostitute, but a sort of camp follower who'd been lovers of many with young officers, then generals, then princes, and finally she'd met Peter the Great. She wasn't even Russian. She was actually Baltic. She was Scandinavian, and he renamed her Catherine, and he crowned her empress, and she became Catherine the First. Catherine the Great is Catherine the Second. Catherine the First, who's a very forgotten figure. When he died, she succeeded him in her own right as empress, and then there was a male emperor, and then there were 2 female emperors, 3 female empresses in a row, and then Catherine the Great. So, in fact, the most chauvinist country in Europe had the most powerful, and many of them were incredibly able. I mean, Elisaveta, who was Peter the Great's daughter, was also extremely, quite an able empress, though no one came near to Catherine the Great. So what a bizarre situation, isn't it? That it had a century of women rulers. And And then, of course, when Catherine the Great's son, Paul, hated Potemkin, hated his mother, and hated all lovers and all women being in any power. So he made it a completely male succession from then on. So that's why there were no more female empresses in their own right. And you know, it's a very chauvinist country. They kind of need it. They feel they need a male ruler, and they're very, you know, they want a mujik to be ruling them, a sort of tough man. So, I mean, you're right. It's a strange thing, but some of their greatest rulers have been women.
What languages did you read in doing your research?
Well, most of these letters are actually in French. So I read French, but also I learned Russian to do this book. Not as well as I should have, but I certainly couldn't have done it without it. And I mean, the thrill of finding, I mean, all these letters. I mean, some of them are well known. Some of the Potemkin letters and Catherine letters are very well known, have been published in 1 million books. But many of the ones that I found hadn't been published at all, and hadn't really been identified as by them at all either. So, also, I think William will agree with me on this, that, you know, if you're writing about someone, if they're a fascinating person, a giant, a titanic character in history, just about everything about them is interesting. So with Potemkin and Catherine, for example, I found all their bills, invoices, and they were always ordering paintings by Joshua Reynolds, jewelry, china sets. You know, they were buying vast collections from Walpole and other people in Europe. Yeah, and so at Houghton, yeah, and so of course they never paid their bills, but all the bills are there. So you've got all these desperate requests from these you know, jewelers and art dealers saying, "Please pay me, I'm going bankrupt." And of course they were so grand they didn't really bother, and half of them went bankrupt. But even the bills are kind of fascinating. Never mind the love letters.
Just a quick question on process. So if this archivist was so glad to see you, how did you get the letters? Did you copy them? How are you able to extract these for your ongoing writing?
What you do is, I'm sure William works in a similar way, is, you know, you just sit there for hours and look through this stuff. You know, and read what you can, because it's all handwritten. A lot of it's handwritten, especially in the 18th century, everything's handwritten, and so, you know, sometimes you need to ask people's help to read stuff. Sometimes you think it doesn't look very interesting, and you don't bother, and you keep going. A lot of it, you just sort of suddenly find something so exciting that you write it. And I just write it. I'm completely old-fashioned. I write everything onto cards, which I put in card indexes, and the essence of the way I write these books is what I call blending, which is that usually in academic historians, they find a document, they put it in their book, and it just appears once in their book, and they put a great wad of it in the book, and then they forget about it and move on. What I do is I look at a letter, and I say, the first paragraph will be very interesting when I write about what her favorite book was. You know, the second paragraph is very interesting when I write about how much she liked her new lover. And the third one I will use in another place in the book, because it's all about the war with Poland. So I will divide it up. So I will often take notes 3 times on one document, one short document. I'm sure you do the same thing.
I use card indexes too.
Yeah,
Same way.
because you can't do that on computer.
By topic, by person, and often by place.
Yeah, so you have lots of end up with a room full of these boxes which sort of have funny things like, you know, Catherine the Great and flowers, Catherine the Great and the Polish War, Catherine the Great and her hemorrhoids, and things like that. And it's a very old-fashioned way. Actually, I mean, we recently went to walk up the your lovely trail here, and we were just saying, how many more of these books can we write? Because they're agony, and yet they're wonderful when you've done them. How much time do we have?
We have about 2 minutes.
Okay, a couple more questions.
Lady standing up here, and then the lady behind her.
I read once that some
doctors in Germany, when Catherine the Great was first born, assigned her the gender of a male child. Do you know anything about that? Is that a false rumor?
That's a false rumor. That's a false rumor. She was very much a woman. But I should just say, all these stories about Catherine the Great being born a woman, having sex with a horse.
Where's that from?
All these things are invented by the British press.
What was the basis for that?
There's no basis for it. It's just that she had a very public, scandalous sex life that offended a lot of men at the time. She was a very liberated woman who could do what the hell she liked, and a lot of women hate that. A lot of women hate that. And the Daily Mail didn't quite exist, but the equivalent of the Daily Mail, in 1790, in 1791, there was a thing called the Ochakov crisis. And this crisis was between England trying to stop Russia getting gains on the Black Sea and taking the Crimea, very like what's happening today, in fact. And Britain, under Pitt the Younger, was trying to stop them. And the English press became very Russophobe and invented all these stories about Catherine the Great, and Potemkin, for that matter. So that's where that story comes from.
All right, one more quick one.
Thank you. Oh, I could be wrong, but I think that Catherine the Great was responsible for the Beyond the Pale, that place where, the Jews.
That's the Pale is the ring around Dublin, the hills around Dublin. So Beyond the Pale was anyone outside the Irish metropolitan, the Dublin.
It has nothing
metropolitan
to do with
region.
Russia.
Well, okay, that's true. No, Beyond the Pale is the expression Beyond the Pale is an Irish expression, which Professor Dalrymple has explained beautifully. The Pale was technically, well, this is a strange thing. Russia had very few Jews. It hardly had any Jews in it until the partitions of Poland, which started in 1772 and ended in 1793-94. And basically, Catherine the Great Russia swallowed the whole of a huge wad of Poland, and suddenly found herself with several million Jews, which Russia had never had before. And there was huge popular feeling against Jews at her court. And so she said that the Jews should remain in that area. There was no repression of Jews under Catherine the Great. She was very enlightened about Jewish practices. She believed they should be allowed to do exactly what they liked. She herself was not a very religious Orthodox Russian at all. In fact, she was totally irreligious. So she had no kind of feeling about the Jews, that they killed Christ, all the things, but ordinary Russians did. So she had to be very careful. It happened that Prince Potemkin was not just neutral about Jews, he was a Philo-Semite, probably the only one ever to reach high positions in Russia. And he traveled all the time with a Jewish rabbi called Joshua Zeitlin, with whom he loved to discuss the Bible, Hebrew, the scriptures, and so on, and who also supplied his army. And he had him made a Baron Zeitlin. And he brought in many Jews to settle in the areas around Odessa, the Black Sea, which were outside the Pale, in fact. So Catherine allowed Jews to move into new territories outside their home area. So technically she did found the Pale, but it was not the repressive Pale with millions of laws against the Jews that it became under her grandson. I think that's probably the end.
And the Irish one is named after that?
No, the Irish one has nothing to do with it whatsoever. Yeah.
All right, we're
Totally
out of time.
unconnected. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Please help me
Thank you very much.